Okay, we're back with another interview for Crystal Lake, and this time we're back for the Dark Tide 14 anthology with Jasper Bark, who had to sit out the last interview, so we're giving him another chance. Anyway, and I'm going to let him introduce himself, so take it away.
Yeah, apologies for not being on the last interview. I'm afraid you were very lovely, and they said I was sick. I was actually incarcerated in a Turkish prison, but I did manage to talk my way out of that, surprisingly enough. So here I am, a free man, and I can answer all your questions about F.U.B.B. F.U.B.B.
Yes, and we're still not going to tell you what that stands for because YouTube will be beaten to us. So,
Plus up beyond belief. Actually,
yeah,
it's fluffed
okay.
up. It's mentioned after my hair, which is now, as you can see, fluffed up beyond belief.
So, how did you get involved in the project?
Well, um, our publisher, the delightful Joe Meinhardt, has some very, very, very incriminating photos of me. And I've been on him for ages. I've been saying, like, dude, when are you going to release those photos? And he's like, Jasp, if I release those photos, you'll be arrested in like 27 countries. And I'm like, I know, right? Are you going to release them? And he's like, no, I am never going to release them. And I was like, you are such a tease, Joe. And then he was like, well, do you want to be in my next Dark Tides book? And I went off in a bit of a huff and had a sulk. And then I remembered that the restraining orders that Candice and Daniel have out on me are about to expire. So I was like, hey guys, do you want to be in this Dark Tides with me? And they were backing away, looking for like the nearest blunt object. And they were saying, like, are you going to send us any more pictures? And I was saying, like, not if you're in this anthology with me. So basically, they agreed, and the rest is history. Extremely sordid history, but history nonetheless.
Okay.
Any other story, by the way, is a complete lie.
Yes.
The truth can finally come out. As I said, I'm a free man for the time being.
Okay, but far more colorful than the one Candace and Daniel told, I will say.
I know, but they've seen the photos. They weren't going to open their mouths.
Yes, no doubt they have a non-disclosure agreement as well. So give everyone an overview of what your novella is about.
Right. It's called The Church of the Splatter Spray Saints, and it's about a particularly shady blood cult known as the Brethren in the Blood, who are also known by their detractors as the Church of the Splatter Spray Saints. They tend to hold the world's strangest and goriest tent revival meetings, usually on those bits of wasteland that sit in liminal spaces between cities, between states and counties, where uncaught serial killers tend to dump their bodies. In this particular meeting in question, where the novella starts, Cindy, Mark, and George, who are evangelical missionaries from the One Light Ministry, are attempting to go undercover in the Brethren in the Blood to infiltrate the meeting in order to rescue one of their donors who has fallen into the cult's clutches. Meanwhile, George Harding, who is the grand guru of the cult, secretly actually both fears and detests the people who turn up and practically worship him. If he can get through tonight's meeting, he just might make enough money to retire for good. Meanwhile, Dmitry, who is part of the Russian mafia and his handler, and the Russian mafia are secretly actually backing the whole of the Brethren of the Blood, desperately wants to kill George. And when he learns of a most unique and incredibly deadly biological weapon that's about to be released into the meeting, he thinks he might just have his chance. However, it's likely that all of them are going to go through a strange and most dark communion in the Church of the Splatter Spray Saints. And I can promise you, this is a story like none you have ever read before.
Well, it does sound interesting.
Thank you.
So the theme of the anthology is hardcore horror, as previous viewers of
Mhm.
the previous interview have know, and anyone who's coming in, that's what you're going to get. So, what were your inspirations for your book?
Um, There were a few. Initially speaking, I was thinking about um, the Grand Guignol. The Grand Guignol is probably the absolute birth of splatterpunk. It was a theatre set in an old church on the south bank of the Seine in Paris, where they used to put on shows roughly from about 1890 through to 1963, which was little reviews of like 3 or 4 20-minute plays, usually based on Edgar Allan Poe stories or original scripts, in which people were carved up into tiny little pieces on the stage in front of the eager audience. This had a huge cult following, and pretty much every special effects guru from Georges Méliès to Tom Savini, all the way up to the guy who does Greg Nicotero, all of them basically their people who learned their craft and people who were inspired by the Grand Guignol. And when people talk about splatterpunk, and they don't want to say splatterpunk in the same way that people talk about pornography, and they don't want to use dirty words like pornography, they say erotica. And if they don't want to use words like comic books, if they're talking about comic strips, they say graphic novels. In the same way, if people don't say splatterpunk or hardcore horror, they use the word Grand Guignol. So this was the very birth of hardcore horror, way back before the birth of cinema. It's fascinated me for decades, and I've read just about every book I can get on it, and I've read a lot of the play scripts. There's even a tiny little film in one of those strange Mondo films where they take a 10-minute excerpt from a play, which was almost probably the last performance of the Grand Guignol in 1963. I forget the name of the Mondo, but if you Google it, I'll just put in Grand Guignol 1963 into YouTube, you'll probably find it. And I wanted to do something about that, but I also wanted to do something that was quite tongue-in-cheek and highly satirical. For some strange reason, when I was thinking about the Grand Guignol, I started thinking about tent revival meetings. And I kind of started thinking, what if there was like a tent revival meeting where people actually acted out Grand Guignol style situations? But perhaps what if it's a religious meeting, but in order to make religious points for this particularly strange cult that worships blood, they put on sketches, comedy sketches, in which they hack people up. And even though this is special effects, what if they actually used real human body parts in these special effects? And then my mind started to spin out off from that, and all the parts began to fall into place for what became Church of the Splatter Spray Saints.
Fascinating. So, what appeals to you about the boundary pushing aspects of extreme horror?
I think it's the fact, what appeals to me to horror, about horror in particular, is horror is an extremely emotive genre. It's closer, I mean, I've mentioned porn, it's quite close to porn, and it's quite close to humor, in that those are the only 3 genres that want a direct physical reaction from its audience. Humor makes you laugh, horror makes you scream. We don't need to mention the last one. And that I know a lot of horror, such as quiet horror and mainstream horror, generally tends to have a sense of unease about it. But most horror has quite a heightened melodrama about it. It gives you, I think people go to horror for a very specific emotional release. I know that people who are interested in the kind of darker, more hardcore horror, many of the readers I've spoken to, they either work in frontline professions like medicine, or they're firefighters, or they've been in the armed forces, and they've seen things or they've which they need to deal with. And so a highly emotive story with an awful lot of visceral content allows them an emotional release. It allows them a bit of a purge. Equally speaking, people who've had some type of traumatic situation in their past, whether it be a bad family or a bad relationship, or whatever. I've spoken to a lot of readers who deal with their trauma through reading quite dark, hardcore splatter. So I think what appeals to me is the fact that it's the visceral nature, the incredibly potent mix of sex and violence, have a really basic, atavistic, primitive level they allow a huge release. And I like horror because it's extremely emotional. I want you to laugh. I want you to cry. I do even want you to scream, and I certainly want you to shudder, um, and be a little bit grossed out. And so the taboo pushing, envelope stretching, boundary transgressing natures of splatterpunk is very appealing to me. It's not the only thing I write, but it is something I've become known for.
And so when you are writing hardcore horror and pushing those boundaries, do you ever find yourself second guessing how far you're going, or do you just sort of sort it out when you edit?
I think there's kind of an instinct. I spent many years as a stand-up comic throughout my 20s and early 30s. And when you up night after night after night in front of an audience, you develop an instinct, not just for how this particular individual audience is going to respond to humor, but you kind of know what's funny and what's not funny. In the way that a gibbon might be funny, but a baboon isn't. And I know that sounds like strange, like what do you mean? But you'll just get this instinct. I could say this, and that will get a laugh. I could say that, which to most people's ears would sound equally the same, but you realize that won't get a laugh. You develop a specific instinct. I think when you're dealing with how far you're going to go, and are we going to go there, you develop a bit of an instinct. Your instinct is, as an author, is to push it too far, to realize you've gone too far, and to cut it at the appropriate moment. But I think well, most authors, I'm sure some will disagree with this, overwrite in their early drafts. And it was Hemingway who said, great novels aren't written, they're rewritten. And also Fitzgerald, who was very, very keen, saying, I'm not necessarily one of the world's best writers, but I am one of the world's best editors of my own work. I mean, it's fascinating when you look at early manuscripts and early drafts of certain key novels, and you see how cleverly the authors have pared down work. So, in the same way that you would tend to overwrite quite a bit in your first draft, and as you go into your second draft, you probably find you can lose like 9 to 10% of it just in excess verbiage. When it comes to the gory scenes, when it comes to really pushing your audience, sometimes you just push it a bit too far, and you realize, I've overplayed it. And the thing is, as well, when you overplay it, you not only risk losing your audience, they kind of the suspension of disbelief will go because you've just pushed it a bit too far, and it'll almost stop being horrific and just either be lame or quite funny, and you'll get the wrong response. So I think it's an instinctual understanding of how the audience responds, and also a knowledge of how to edit your own work. That so you're not second guessing yourself, because if you've been doing this enough, and if you're doing this right, like my two collaborators on this project, you know what will work and you know what won't work, and you know where the line is and how to go right up to the edge of it and then stop.
So, what do you think the readers will enjoy most about your novella?
Um, Actually, I would hope they will. I think this depends entirely upon the reader. Readers have different responses to my work, and often it falls into different camps. This particular story, I think some people will enjoy the fact that it is highly gory and it's very creatively gory. If you were watching it in a film, you go, "Wow, how did they do that special effect?" You'd probably think, "I've never seen that before." So those people wanting to read something in the way of splatter book they've never seen before will enjoy that. Those readers who actually want to read a story that's probably not like anything they've read before as well, who want to read something a little bit different in the genre, will also probably enjoy it. And those readers who might appreciate the fact that there's actually a lot of subtle satire and not so subtle satire running throughout it, well, I would hope would appreciate that. Often these are different audiences, and when you start to read the reviews of your work, you begin to spot different camps and different responses to what you write. But I am guessing from responses to my previous work that those would be the things that various different subsets of readers will enjoy.
Okay, so what were some of the most difficult parts of writing the story? Did you get stuck on something, or was it smooth sailing all the way?
I think this was relatively smooth sailing most of the way. Um, some there's always, for me when I write, there's an element, part of the work I'll always leave to slightly pants it, in that it will just occur in the moment. I will extemporize it, and parts I will work out specific plot beats and stories in advance. I don't recall having, sometimes, if you're aware of the fact that in order for all the moving parts to come together in a story, you spend 2 or 3 days just screaming at your keyboard and at your computer screen, and kind of burying your head in your hands, telling yourself you're a talentless git. I didn't have that this time. Most of the story fell into place. I think, as I was planning it all out, and before I began the first draft, I was aware that there was just a tiny key bit missing. I didn't know what that was. But by the time I began, that had occurred to me. And so the story had its own momentum. It was written quite quickly, given its 27,000 words. So it kind of bubbled out. 2,000 words at a time was over and done within a couple of weeks, the first draft. And then after that, it was a matter of refining and refining and refining, and hiding the fact from many readers of how awful a writer I am in my first draft.
Yeah, well, it's nice when that happens, when it just bubbles out.
It is, yes.
So what were your
Come
favorite
off
parts
from
of
an open wound. What
yeah,
were my
so what
favourite?
yeah, what was your favorite parts of writing the story? Is there a scene that
Um,
you enjoyed, or a character?
yeah, it's probably, as I mentioned, there are a lot of really bizarre comedy sketches, which are set up as kind of as really crass, ridiculous political satire on the part of the Brethren in the Blood, and they're full of like really questionable humour. And I was aware of the fact that I was doing and writing, my characters were doing, and I was writing absolutely preposterously unbelievable things, and they were laughing about it. So that you would be reading it with your eyeballs kind of like, okay, no. That was quite fun. I suppose the other thing as well, while I was writing it, I was reading a lot of Thomas Ligotti, who might not be an author anyone would associate with Splatterpunk, because he's far more in the cosmic literary horror mold. But one of the things I love about his work is there's a very strong philosophical bent to it. Not just that, but he tends to actually invent whole philosophies, cut from whole cloth, purely just for one individual story, and then he completely discards them and moves on to another one. And even though they're quite bleak, and sometimes quite overwhelming, and intensely intellectually complex, that's one part of his work I find extremely exciting. So I wanted to kind of do something similar for this, perhaps not quite as complex as Ligotti. So the Brethren in the Blood have an entire culture, an entire set of religious beliefs, and they have a way of dressing. So I invented, for this particular story, an entire subculture, an entire belief system, and a whole substratum of society that came together to create it. And that was quite fun.
So, did any of the characters stand out for you, or do they all just sort of have the same sort of level of favoritism?
They all stood out. I was quite glad that they all had a an arc. They all entered the story with one particular set of goals and ideas, and over the course of the story, very little that they were planning or wanting to do came to fruition in the way that they thought. But we're able to explore their background. We're able to explore what led them to the point that they're actually at in the story, and each one of them has a definable arc. And a satisfactory ending, albeit perhaps not a happy ending for any of them, but certainly one that makes sense. So there wasn't one that stood out. I had a great deal of sympathy and affection for them all. I hope the reader will, even though probably very few of them are likable characters.
Yeah. They're sympathetic, but not likable.
You can understand, I would hope, how they came to this point in the story, most of them. Um, yeah, but I don't know if you'd want to kind of sit down and have a drink with any of them.
Okay, so what's up next for you? What are you working on these days?
I have a huge number of things coming out. Crystal Lake are just about to relaunch three of my books, The Final Cut, Quiet Places, and Run to Ground, as part of a new ongoing series called Bark Bites Horror, which is going to be like a goosebump for grown-ups or a sexed up scary stories to tell in the dark. It's a series, it's kind of being launched as Horror 2.0. This is horror regened, retooled, and remade for a new generation. For those people who might have a slightly jaded palette and think they've seen it all in horror, this is the good stuff you've been looking for. That's being done in May. In June, we're then launching, as part of the Bark Bites horror series, a trilogy called Draw You In, which I suppose the elevator pitch, which is always a really stupid thing. Elevator pitch is basically if you were stuck in an elevator with a movie executive and you have 10 seconds to pitch him your idea, that's what you'd say. The elevator pitch for this might be Cavalier and Clay meets Clive Barker. It's set against the historical backdrop of horror comics from the 1950s to the present day. But it also deals with many subcultures of the United States, because it takes a road trip right across the whole of the States. And it deals with not just the secret history of the United States and the founding of the United States, but also possibly the secret to life, the cosmos, and everything. And that's over 3 novels. Those are the big things I'm working on at the moment. There's a lot of publicity and some other exciting events we've got coming around that. I'm launching a new website. I have a podcast waiting in the wings, and a YouTube channel, and a bunch of novellas coming out later on in the year as well.
Lots to look forward to.
Yes.
Okay, so I think we'll wrap the interview up here. I'd like to thank you for being a guest today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been great fun.
And please tell everyone where they can find you and your books.
I suppose Amazon, Barnes and Noble, the Crystal Lake website are the best places to go. You can find me on most social media. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, I'm on LinkedIn. Those are the places you most likely to find me. Other than that, as I say, my website's launching very, very soon. That's going to be jasperbark.com. Go and check that out too.
Okay, and that's it for this interview, and bye for now.
Thanks very much.